Saskatchewan, Canada's most interesting province. It remains part of Western Canada, a region sometimes alienated and sometimes integral to the story of Canada, with a story of separatism more interesting than Quebec's. Their separatist movements spanned from more autonomy to independence to an even vacuer proposal, the incorporation of Saskatchewan into the United States. As much as this may seem like a brainstorming session about how to make Saskatchewan more interesting, these ideas didn't come out of the blue. They were potential responses to a referendum that could have broken up Canada as we know it. Not just Saskatchewan, but Western Canada as a whole has a history of being at odds with the federal government, stemming from years of economic alienation, perceived underrepresentation, and complaining about Quebec. Even today, these are issues that define the dichotomy between Western Canada and Eastern Canada, and this is why it's important to discuss them. So let's start with the money. Western Canada has money, oil money, big fat stacks of oil and resource money, centered around Alberta and Saskatchewan. Hell, it's one of the few reasons people still live there. Western Canada as a political identity only really came about in the 1970s. And if you know anything about Canada, I'm sure you can guess what caused it. Oil is a major factor here, especially for Alberta, but let's not forget about the other resources produced by Saskatchewan: uranium, potash, and drunk drivers. The reliance on natural resources is not nearly as significant in the rest of Canada, where there is more of a focus on processing and exporting said resources. You may have heard about current-day Prime Minister Trudeau's hate in Western Canada. If the West hates Justin Trudeau now, oh boy, they had nothing on old man Pierre Trudeau in the 70s. They hated his budget, his elitist attitude, and especially his deduction from provincial natural resource royalties via federal tax. Those big words mean that they took a lot of money from oil and resource revenues. Trudeau's senior's oil policy and the National Energy Program introduced in his budget were so unpopular that the term Western alienation was coined in response to it. The official proposal promised, according to Trudeau,
the most important reason for developing these national policies was a determination to promote the domestic oil industry and encourage economic growth in Western Canada.
Western response to this can be best summed up by the History of Alberta website saying,
producing provinces in the West saw the NEP as another strategy to keep energy prices depressed to benefit the energy-hungry provinces in the East.
Some leaders of provincial governments, such as Roy Romanoff, even had a resource war with the Canadian government. This was bizarre even for the time, due to the idea of Saskatchewan being a mostly social democratic state, while Albertans, who declared Western alienation, were mostly conservatives. As David McGrane said in his book Back to Blakeney,
the events of Saskatchewan's resource wars were important because they demonstrated the approach of a social democratic government to the management of natural resources in the Canadian Federation.
See, the Western provinces preferred to privatize their natural resources and open them up for free trade, while Old Man Trudeau's government preferred to put tariffs on the oil and sell it themselves. Trudeau also believed in a protectionist policy, but all of this essentially meant that they were against the privatization of oil. As a result, in the 70s and especially in the 80s, a small minority of people began to take such radical ideas as independence from Canada a lot more seriously. The concept later culminated in parties like the Western Independence Party in 1988, whose biggest accomplishment was this cool flag over here. There is also the issue of equalization payments, which is a very complicated issue. To put it simply, all Canadians pay federal taxes, and portions of that tax revenue are then distributed to less wealthy or have-not provinces, so they can provide reasonable provincial services at a reasonable rates of taxation. As of this video's release, there are 5 have-not provinces: Manitoba, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. The general idea that causes a rift is the idea of capital flow away from the West. Many Western Canadians believe that they are unfairly paying the federal government money that they aren't getting back, especially considering that one of the have-not provinces is the second most populated province in the country, alongside with it being Quebec. Moving on from the economic perspective of the West, another factor in Western alienation is the perceived lack of representation. One notable example is the Canadian Senate. The Senate is more like the House of Lords than the US Senate.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question. I think, don't you have to tell me when to talk?
in that it is completely undemocratic, unnecessarily complicated, and serves virtually no purpose. The Senate splits Canada into 4 regions to allocate senators: the West, Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. Each region gets 24 senators split amongst the constituent provinces. And just for the sake of making things unnecessarily complicated, Newfoundland is not a part of any region and gets 6 senators. And each of Canadian territories also get a senator, for a total of 105 senators. If you know anything about Canadian demographics, outside of everyone living 2 inches from the border, you will see how this isn't exactly representative in any terms of population. For example, Prince Edward Island has 38,000 people represented by a single senator, whereas British Columbia has 800,000 people represented by each senator. The issue stems from a political system that has been updated to address the population shifts since the early 1900s. All of this has fostered a perception in Western Canada that they are underrepresented in the Senate. Politically, the West tends to vote for the Conservative Party for primarily economic reasons, as stated before. They tend to support more private property laws than the rest of Canadian state. This sort of attitude contrasts with the more moderate views of Eastern Conservatives, which often leads to party splits and internal rifts, such as the Reform Party splitting from the Progressive Conservative Party. Most elections show the West being a sweep Tory victory, besides British Columbia. In the modern political scene, to become a party leader of the Conservatives, you have to appeal to the more populist and more social conservative West to win. However, if you want to win the federal elections, you have to appeal more to the moderate voters in the East, otherwise they will vote Liberal. As a result, Western conservatives are scarcely represented in power nationally, creating a sentiment of underrepresentation, breeding grounds for autonomism or even separatism. Let's address the elephant in the room and talk about a large motive for Western irritation and alienation: Quebec. In contrast to other Anglophone provinces of Canada, Quebec is primarily Francophone with its own culture, language, and history, unique to the rest of Canada. Quebec has a long laundry list of certain rights and privileges that were afforded to it to preserve its unique Francophone culture, and this was especially coming to fruition in the 70s. Exceptions for French and making it the national language of Canada were some of these privileges that the West was frustrated with. Many people in Western Canada resented the amount of treatment the
Quebecois
were receiving, while the rest of Canada, specifically Western Canada, wasn't getting any of these levels of autonomy. This also especially fed into the ideas of the West being politically underrepresented and economically alienated. Even today,
Bloc Quebecois
is openly anti-oil expansion and economically on the left, with the current leader of the
Bloc Quebecois, François Blanchet,
calling the process
scientifically unacceptable. The government isn't even trying to meet its climate objectives in the first place.
These 3 issues of economic alienation, underrepresentation, and Quebec being Quebec were especially apparent at a tumultuous time of Canadian history, the Quebec secession vote of 1995. This is finally where we can see how Saskatchewan may very well have left Canada and possibly joined the United States. On the 30th of October 1995, the Quebec government had a referendum on whether they would support independence or if they should stay with the Canadian government. This was a tense time for the provinces, and a sign that Canada could falter or even break up. It seems silly in retrospect, but nobody knew what would happen if Quebec voted yes. In the book The Morning After the Quebec Referendum, and the day it almost was, written by Chantal Hebert and the Prime Minister of Saskatchewan, the one and only Roy Romanoff from earlier, revealed how Saskatchewan examined its options.
At some point or other, one is forced to make a choice. We prepared for it. The documentation is around. We did not make a firm decision. I think we were hoping against hope that the thing would work out the way it worked out, for good or for bad.
Romanov was prepared to stake out a distinct Saskatchewan position and to reach out to other Western Canadian provinces, with actual choices in hand, not just pie-in-the-sky rhetoric.
The reality is that you would really have a dysfunctional country in the event of a yes vote in Quebec. There was no guarantee that what was left over, the rest of Canada, would amount to a functioning entity. How do we deal with Ontario? And what do we do about Atlantic Canada?
In hindsight, some of these considerations were quite wild. They were even ready to adopt the US dollar as the official currency. Some other considerations were Saskatchewan seceding with other provinces to form an independent Western Canada, Saskatchewan seceding to form its own country, and, finally, Saskatchewan joining the United States. Of all the options presented in a Canada collapses scenario, Romanov himself was pro-independence. However, it is interesting to imagine a world where Quebec secedes and Saskatchewan joins the US, not exactly the prettiest of borders. While Canada is no longer at risk of collapsing, there are still movements predicated on Western alienation, primarily the Vexit movement, which centers around the Maverick Party, a small Albertan political party calling for Albertan independence. This movement even has some political influence in Alberta, with acts like the Alberta Sovereignty Act being signed into law. The movement may be fringe, but it is founded on real issues that are debated at the highest levels of Canadian government. After all, a small secessionist movement can stem into a national crisis at the snap of a finger.